The ceremony square in the heart of the Northern Territories was packed with thousands of wolves, all standing in rigid formation as their alpha king prepared to address them. Cale Voss stood on the elevated stone platform, his massive frame casting a shadow that seemed to darken the very air around him. At 32 years old, he had ruled these lands for a decade, and every single day of that reign had been written in blood and fear. His reputation preceded him like a storm cloud. Whispers of his cruelty traveling faster than any messenger could run. They said he had personally executed over 100 wolves for treason, that he had dismantled 3 separate rebellions before they could even take their first breath, that his wolf was so massive and black, it looked like a piece of the night sky had fallen to earth and learned to hunt. The crowd was silent, that particular kind of silence that comes from terror rather than respect. Kyle's beta, Marcus, stood 2 steps behind him, his eyes scanning the assembly with practiced wariness. This was the annual allegiance ceremony, where every pack leader in the Northern Territories came to publicly renew their oath of loyalty. It was theater, really, a performance designed to remind everyone exactly who held the power. Cale's dark eyes swept across the sea of faces, noting the way people flinched when his gaze passed over them, the way mothers pulled their children closer, the way even the strongest alphas kept their eyes lowered, in submission. Then he saw her. She stood near the back of the Omega section, which was deliberately positioned in the least favorable viewing area, as was tradition in the Northern Territories. But despite her placement among the lowest-ranked wolves, she stood out like a flame in darkness. She was not looking down at the ground like every other Omega present. Instead, her eyes were fixed directly on him, and there was something in her gaze that made Cale's wolf stir with an unfamiliar sensation. She was beautiful in an understated way, with long dark hair that fell in waves past her shoulders, and golden eyes that seemed to glow with an inner light. She wore simple clothing, a healer's garb if he was reading the symbols correctly, and she carried herself with a quiet dignity that seemed completely out of place in this crowd of cowering wolves. Kyle felt irritation spike through him. Who was this Omega who dared to look at him so directly? Did she not know the rules? Did she not understand that eye contact with the Alpha King without permission was grounds for punishment? He decided to make an example of her, to remind everyone present why they should fear him. He let his alpha aura expand outward, a crushing wave of dominance that made wolves throughout the square whimper and drop to their knees. The power rolled through the crowd like a physical force, and Kyle watched with satisfaction as even the pack alphas struggled to remain standing. Then he focused that power directly on the mysterious Omega, concentrating his aura into a spear of pure dominance aimed straight at her heart. And then he roared. It was not a human sound, though it came from his human throat. It was the voice of his wolf, amplified by his alpha power and his fury, a sound that had made enemies flee and allies tremble. The roar echoed off the stone buildings surrounding the square, reverberating through the air like thunder, and every wolf present felt it in their bones. That primal command to submit, to bow, to acknowledge their inferior position in the hierarchy. Wolves throughout the square collapsed completely, some of them shifting partially in their terror, others simply going limp as their bodies overrode their minds and forced submission. But the Omega with the golden eyes did not bow. She did not collapse. She did not even flinch. Instead, as Cale's roar faded into echoes, she smiled at him. It was not a mocking smile or a challenging one. It was gentle, almost sad, as if she could see something in him that caused her sorrow rather than fear. That smile hit Cale harder than any physical blow ever had. Something in his chest cracked, a sensation he had not felt in so long he had forgotten it was possible. His wolf, which had been a vicious, snarling presence in his mind for years, suddenly went very still, and then it whispered a single word that made Cale's blood run cold. Mate, if you are enjoying this story of an alpha king meeting his unexpected match, please like this video and let me know in the comments what you think of Lyra's fearless response. Should she have bowed? Or is her defiance exactly what Kyle needs? Subscribe to hear how this powerful story unfolds. Kyle felt panic surge through him, hot and overwhelming. No, absolutely not. He could not have a mate, and he certainly could not have an Omega mate who looked at him with compassion instead of fear. He had spent 10 years building walls around himself, turning his heart into stone, becoming the monster that this kingdom needed to stay in line. A mate would ruin everything. A mate would make him vulnerable. A mate would see the parts of himself he had buried so deep he sometimes forgot they existed. He shoved his wolf back down with brutal force, ignoring its protests, and turned away from the Omega, as if she meant nothing. He continued with the ceremony, accepting oaths of loyalty from pack leaders with mechanical efficiency, but his mind was racing the entire time. When the ceremony finally ended, Kale strode from the platform without looking back, but he gave Marcus a single quiet command: find out everything about her. Bring her to the castle. Marcus, who had been Kale's beta since the beginning of his reign, knew better than to ask questions. He simply nodded and disappeared into the dispersing crowd. Kyle made his way back to the castle alone, his mind churning with thoughts he did not want to have. The castle was a massive structure of black stone and sharp towers, imposing and cold, much like its master. It had been in the Voss family for generations, and Kale had turned it into a fortress, a symbol of his unbreakable power. He went straight to his private chambers, dismissing the servants with a wave of his hand, and poured himself a drink from the crystal decanter on his desk. His office was sparse and functional, with maps of the territories covering one wall and reports stacked on every available surface. This was where he spent most of his time, ruling his kingdom with an iron fist, making the hard decisions that kept the Northern Territories stable and secure. Or at least, that was what he told himself. In truth, Kale knew that his rule had brought stability through terror, security through oppression. The Omega laws alone were evidence of that. Strict regulations that treated Omegas as property rather than people, that required them to register with the state, that forbade them from holding positions of authority or owning land. Kale drained his glass and poured another, trying to ignore the way his wolf was clawing at his insides, demanding that he go back and claim his mate. He had not wanted to become this person. Once, a lifetime ago, he had been different. He had been young and idealistic, believing that he could rule with compassion, that he could change the Northern Territories for the better. But the world had taught him otherwise. His father, the previous Alpha King, had been murdered by conspirators when Kale was only 22, and Kale had inherited a kingdom on the brink of civil war. The Council of Alphas, the powerful group that advised the throne, had expected him to be weak, easy to manipulate. They had been wrong. Kale had crushed the rebellion with ruthless efficiency, executing the leaders and scattering their followers. He had consolidated power, eliminating anyone who questioned his authority, and somewhere along the way, he had lost himself. The idealistic, young alpha who wanted to make the world better had died, and in his place was the monster everyone feared. It was easier this way, Kale told himself. Fear was reliable. Fear kept people in line. Love, compassion, mercy, those were weaknesses that his enemies could exploit. But then why did that Omega's smile haunt him? Why did the lack of fear in her eyes make him feel like he was missing something essential? Marcus returned 2 hours later with a report that only deepened Kale's confusion. The Omega's name was Lyra Ashwood, and she was a mystery. She had appeared in the Northern Territories 6 months ago, working as a traveling healer, moving from village to village and offering her services to anyone who needed them. She had no pack affiliation, no family records, no history before her arrival. She was not registered in the Omega database, which was technically illegal, but she had been so helpful to the communities she visited that local authorities had overlooked the violation. She was known for her exceptional healing abilities, not just in the physical sense, but in the emotional one as well. People said that she could heal wounds that went deeper than flesh, that she had a gift for seeing into people's hearts. Kyle stared at the report, his jaw tight. An unregistered Omega with mysterious origins and unusual abilities. It sounded like a security threat, and under normal circumstances, he would have had her arrested and interrogated. But she was his mate, and despite his best efforts to deny it, he could not ignore the pull he felt toward her. His wolf was demanding that he go to her, that he claim her, that he protect her. Cale compromised with himself. He would bring her to the castle, ostensibly as a healer for the royal household. He would keep her close where he could watch her, figure out what she was hiding, and maintain control over the situation. And he would absolutely not acknowledge the mate bond. He could control this. He had controlled everything else in his life through sheer force of will, and this would be no different. When Lyra was brought to the castle the next day, Cale made sure he was not the one to greet her. He watched from a high window as Marcus escorted her through the gates, noting the way she looked around with curiosity rather than fear. Most people approached the castle with trepidation, aware that it was as much a prison as a palace, but Lyra walked with calm grace, pausing to admire the garden that Cale's mother had planted decades ago, and that he had maintained despite himself. When Marcus brought her to the throne room where Cale waited, he made sure to be sitting in his full regalia, the image of intimidating power. Lyra entered the room and her golden eyes found his immediately. Once again, she did not look away. Once again, she did not show fear. Cale leaned forward in his throne, letting his alpha aura fill the room. "You failed to bow at the ceremony," he said, his voice cold and sharp. "That is a violation of protocol and a sign of disrespect to your Alpha King." Lyra tilted her head slightly, studying him with that same gentle, sorrowful expression. "I meant no disrespect, Your Majesty," she said, and her voice was like music, soft and clear. "I simply saw no reason to bow to fear. If you wish to be honored, perhaps first you should give your people a reason to honor you beyond terror." The throne room went silent. Marcus made a small choking sound, clearly shocked that anyone would speak to Cale this way. Several guards reached for their weapons, waiting for Cale's order to seize her. Cale himself felt rage explode through him, white-hot and overwhelming. How dare she? How dare this Omega, this nobody with no pack and no status, speak to him as if he were a child in need of correction? He stood from his throne, his full height and power on display, and took a step toward her. His wolf was snarling, but underneath the anger, Cale felt something else. Shame. Because her words had hit a truth he did not want to acknowledge. "You will watch your tongue, Omega," Cale growled, and he let his eyes flash with his wolf, a warning that he was on the edge of violence. "Or you will find that this castle has dungeons far less pleasant than its guest rooms." Lyra met his gaze steadily. "I have survived far worse than your dungeons, Alpha King," she said quietly, "and I have seen into the hearts of far more damaged wolves than you. You can threaten me. You can try to break me, but it will not change the truth. You are not the monster you pretend to be. You are a wounded wolf who has forgotten that there is another way to lead besides fear." Cale felt something in him break at those words, but he could not show weakness. Not here. Not in front of his people. He forced his expression into one of cold disdain. "You will serve as a healer in this castle," he said, making it a command rather than a request. "You will tend to the household staff and anyone else who requires your services. You will register properly in the Omega database. You will follow all castle protocols, and you will learn to hold your tongue in my presence, or you will face consequences. Do you understand?" Lyra was quiet for a long moment, and Cale had the unsettling feeling that she was seeing right through him, past all his armor and defenses, down to the broken parts he kept hidden. Finally, she nodded. "I understand," she said. "But know this, Cale Voss. I will heal those who need healing in this castle, and I suspect that includes you, whether you want it or not." Then she bowed, not in fear or submission, but in the way a healer might bow to a patient, with compassion and resolve. Cale dismissed her with a wave of his hand, and once she was gone, he sank back into his throne, feeling more shaken than he had in years. Over the following weeks, Lyra became a fixture in the castle. and Cale found himself constantly aware of her presence. She worked primarily in the servants' quarters and the healing ward, tending to injuries and illnesses, with a skill that impressed even the castle's veteran physicians. But she did more than just heal physical wounds. Kyle heard reports that she sat with the lonely, listened to the troubled, brought comfort to those who grieved. The castle staff, who had been tense and fearful for years, began to seem lighter somehow, as if Lyra's presence was a balm on wounds Cale had not even known existed. What bothered Cale most was that Lyra did not stay. Confined to the areas where she was supposed to work, she wandered the castle freely, and whenever Kyle encountered her, she treated him with that same gentle directness that made him feel exposed. Once, he found her in his mother's old garden, which he had forbidden everyone from entering. She was tending to the roses, humming softly to herself. When she saw him, she did not apologize or flee. She simply smiled and said, "Your mother must have loved these roses very much. They remember her care." Cale wanted to rage at her for the intrusion, but instead he found himself saying, "She did. She said that beauty was an act of resistance against the darkness of the world." Lyra nodded as if this made perfect sense. "She was wise, your mother. Beauty and compassion are the strongest weapons we have against cruelty. They require more courage than violence ever will." Then she returned to her work, leaving Cale standing there feeling like his carefully constructed walls were crumbling. He tried to maintain distance, tried to focus on his duties as king, but his wolf was becoming increasingly difficult to control. Every time he smelled Lyra's scent, a mixture of jasmine and something wild and clean, his wolf would surge forward demanding that he claim her. Every time he heard her voice, his wolf would go still, listening, as if her words were sacred. The breaking point came during a council meeting 6 weeks after Lyra's arrival. Cale was listening to reports from his advisors, the Council of Alphas, who had helped him consolidate power years ago. They were discussing the Omega laws, proposing even stricter regulations. And Cale found himself thinking about Lyra, about the way she moved through the world with dignity, despite those very laws being designed to strip Omegas of their autonomy. One of the counselors, Alpha Darius, was speaking about mandatory breeding programs to increase the Omega population, treating them like livestock rather than people. And Cale felt disgust rise in his throat. For the first time in years, he questioned the policies he had allowed to stand. "These Omega laws," he said, interrupting Darius mid-sentence. "What is their actual purpose? We claim they are for stability and security, but in practice, they seem designed primarily to subjugate an entire classification of our people." The council members exchanged glances, clearly surprised by this line of questioning. Darius cleared his throat. "Your Majesty, Omegas require strict oversight for their own protection and for the good of society. Without these laws, there would be chaos." Kyle leaned back in his chair, his mind working. "Or perhaps," he said slowly, "without these laws, there would simply be equality. And some of us find that threatening." The room went very quiet. Marcus, who was present as always, gave Cale a look that clearly said, "What are you doing?" But Cale was thinking about Lyra's words, about how he could choose to lead differently, before he could pursue the thought. Further, another counselor, Alpha Thorn, spoke up. "Your Majesty, if I may ask, has someone been influencing your thinking on this matter? Perhaps the new Omega healer we have heard so much about?" Cale felt his wolf bristle at the implied threat to Lyra. He forced his expression to remain neutral. "My thinking is my own, counselor. But I am beginning to wonder if we have built a kingdom on foundations that need to be examined. What do you think should happen when an alpha king starts to question the very laws that maintain his power? Leave a comment below with your thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe so you do not miss what happens next in this story of transformation and forbidden love." The council meeting ended tensely, and Cale knew he had opened a door he might not be able to close. After the counselors departed, Marcus stayed behind, concern evident on his face. "Cale, what is going on with you? You have never questioned the Omega laws before. You helped write some of them." Cale stood and walked to the window, looking out over his kingdom. "I know," he said quietly. And that is exactly the problem, Marcus. I have been so focused on maintaining control, on being strong and unyielding, that I have forgotten to ask whether the things I am controlling are just. Marcus was silent for a moment. This is about her, is it not? The Omega healer, Lyra. Cale did not deny it. She is my mate, he admitted, and saying the words out loud felt like ripping open a wound. My wolf. Recognized her the moment I saw her. And she looks at me, Marcus, and she sees things I have tried to bury. She sees the person I used to be, the one I thought I had killed. Marcus let out a long breath. Mates are a gift, Cale. Why are you fighting this? Because I cannot afford to be vulnerable, Cale said, turning to face his beta. Because the moment I let someone in, the moment I show weakness, my enemies will strike. You know what this kingdom is like. You know what the council would do if they sensed any softness in me. Marcus met his eyes steadily. I know that you have been lonely and miserable for a decade. I know that you have become someone you never wanted to be. And I know that maybe, just maybe, this mate of yours is offering you a chance to find your way back to yourself. Is that not worth the risk? Kyle wanted to argue, but he could not find the words. Instead, he dismissed Marcus and went looking for Lyra. He found her in the healing ward, sitting beside a young servant, who had been injured in a kitchen accident. She was holding the girl's hand and speaking softly, and Kyle could see the pain easing from the servant's face as Lyra worked. When Lyra noticed him, she finished with her patient, and then approached him. Your Majesty, she said, is something wrong? Cale struggled with what to say. Finally, he simply asked, why did you smile at me? At the ceremony, when I roared at you, you smiled. Why? Lyra's golden eyes softened. Because I saw your pain, she said. I saw a wolf who was so afraid of being hurt again that he had turned himself into a weapon. And I thought, how lonely that must be. How exhausting, to carry all that fear and anger and never let anyone help you bear it. I smiled, because I wanted you to know that I saw you, truly saw you, and I was not afraid. Cale felt his carefully maintained control slipping. You should be afraid of me, he said. But his voice lacked its usual edge. I have done terrible things. I have hurt people. I am exactly the monster everyone thinks I am. Lyra reached out and shockingly touched his hand. It was the first time they had made physical contact, and Cale felt the mate bond flare to life between them, a golden thread of connection that made his wolf howl with recognition and longing. You have done terrible things, she agreed. But you are not only those things. People are more complex than their worst actions. The question is not what you have been, Cale. The question is what you choose to become. Cale wanted to pull away, to retreat back into his armor of coldness and control, but he found he could not move. Instead, he stood there with this Omega's hand in his, feeling the warmth of her touch seep into places that had been frozen for years. Tell me about yourself, he said, desperate to shift focus away from his own vulnerability. Who are you really, Lyra Ashwood? Where did you come from? Lyra's expression became guarded for the first time. I am a healer, she said. That is all you need to know. But Kyle saw the shadows in her eyes, the secrets she was keeping, and his instincts sharpened. No, he said. You are more than that. Your healing abilities are beyond anything I have ever seen. You have no pack history, no family records. You carry yourself with a confidence that suggests you are not always a wandering Omega with no status. Who are you really? Lyra pulled her hand back, and Cale felt the loss of contact like a physical ache. If I tell you, she said slowly, it will put both of us in danger. There are people who want my bloodline erased from existence, and they have nearly succeeded. I am the last, and if they find me, they will finish what they started. Cale felt protective instincts surge through him. Tell me, he commanded, using his alpha voice. I can protect you. Lyra laughed, but it was bitter. Can you? Can you protect me from the very people who sit on your council, who advise you, who have been manipulating you since before you even took the throne? Cale went very still. What are you talking about? Lyra looked at him for a long moment, clearly weighing her options. Then she sighed. "I am of the lunar bloodline," she said. "My family were the last of the Omegas who carried the old magic, the healing and visionary gifts that your kind once revered. 30 years ago, the Council of Alphas decided that Omegas with power were a threat to the hierarchy. They systematically hunted down and eliminated every lunar Omega they could find. My mother hid me, gave her life to protect me, and I have been running ever since." Kyle felt shock ripple through him. The lunar bloodline was a legend, a story from old texts and ancient histories. He had thought they were myth, not reality. And the Council had destroyed them? Why would they do that? Lyra's eyes were hard now, filled with old pain. Because we could see the truth. Our visions showed us the corruption, the greed, the conspiracies. We could heal the damage that alphas like your counselors wanted to inflict. We represented everything they feared, Omega power that could challenge alpha dominance. So they erased us and then rewrote history to make it seem like we never existed. Kale's mind was racing. If what Lyra was saying was true, then the Council had committed genocide, and they had been lying to him about it for his entire reign. He thought about Darius and Thorn and the others, about how they had been so quick to support his harshest policies, how they had encouraged his cruelty. Had they been using him? Had they turned him into a tyrant specifically to maintain their own power? "I need to know everything," Kale said. "Everything about the lunar bloodline, about what the Council did, about why they are so threatened by Omegas with power. Lyra, if you are truly my mate, then trust me with this." Lyra searched his face, and Kale let her see his sincerity. Let his walls drop just enough for her to glimpse the person he used to be, beneath the monster he had become. Finally, she nodded. "I will tell you," she said. "But Kale, you need to understand that once you know the truth, you cannot unknow it. You will have to choose what kind of king you want to be. You will have to decide if you are willing to dismantle everything you have built to create something better. Are you ready for that?" Kyle thought about the past decade, about the fear and loneliness and the slow death of his soul. He thought about the young alpha he had been, full of hope and dreams of a better world. And he thought about Lyra's smile, about the way she saw him clearly and still chose to reach out her hand. "Yes," he said, "I am ready." Over the next several weeks, Lyra told Kale everything. She explained how the lunar Omegas had been the spiritual leaders of the wolf community for generations, using their gifts to heal, to guide, to maintain balance. She showed him historical texts that the Council had tried to destroy, documents that proved their existence and their importance. She revealed that her visions had recently shown her something devastating. The Council was not just corrupt, they were actively trafficking Omegas, selling them to the highest bidders in other territories and pocketing the profits. The strict Omega laws that Kale had enforced were not about protection or stability. They were about control, making it easier to treat Omegas as commodities. Kale felt sick as the full scope of the Council's crimes became clear. He had been their tool, their enforcer, the face of a regime built on exploitation and suffering. Every Omega who had been harmed under his laws, every family separated, every life destroyed. He bore responsibility for all of it. Lyra watched him process this knowledge with patient compassion. "I see the guilt consuming you," she said one evening as they sat in his mother's garden, which had become their sanctuary. "But guilt without action is just self-indulgence. What matters now is what you do with this knowledge." Kale looked at her. This extraordinary Omega who had every reason to hate him, and yet looked at him with understanding. "How can you even stand to be near me?" he asked. "How can you be my mate when I have enforced the very laws that destroyed your people?" Lyra reached out and took his hand, that electric connection of the mate bond flaring between them. "Because I can see your heart, Kale. I can see that you are capable of change. You made terrible choices, yes. You let fear and pain turn you into someone cruel. But cruelty is not your nature. It is your armor. And I believe that underneath that armor is an alpha who truly wants to make things right. Can you really believe that Kale can change and atone for his past?" What would you do in Lyra's position? Forgive or walk away? Share your thoughts in the comments, and make sure you are subscribed, because this story is about to reach its most intense turning point. Kyle wanted desperately to believe her, but the weight of his crimes felt crushing. Even if I want to change, he said, even if I dismantle the council and reform the laws, how do I make amends for what I have already done? How do I give back the years that people suffered under my rule? Lyra squeezed his hand. You cannot undo the past, she said gently, but you can ensure that the future is different. You can use your power now to protect instead of harm, to liberate instead of control. And Kale, you can stop running from the mate bond. You can let yourself be loved, and let yourself love in return. That is how healing begins, with connection, with vulnerability, with choosing trust over fear. Kyle felt something crack open in his chest, all the loneliness and pain he had been carrying for so long suddenly rushing to the surface. He pulled Lyra into his arms, holding her close, breathing in her scent, and let himself feel the mate bond fully for the first time. It was overwhelming, a rush of emotion and connection that made his wolf sing with joy and his heart ache with longing. Lyra, he whispered against her hair, I do not deserve you. I do not deserve your compassion or your faith in me. But I swear to you, I will spend the rest of my life trying to become the alpha you see when you look at me. Lyra pulled back just enough to look into his eyes, and then she kissed him. It was soft and sweet and full of promise, and Cal felt like he was being brought back to life after years of being a walking corpse. When they finally separated, both breathing hard, Lyra smiled at him. And this time it was not the sad, compassionate smile she had given him at the ceremony. This was joy, pure and radiant. Now, she said, now we plan how to take down the council and free your kingdom from their corruption. But first, Kale Voss, you need to introduce me properly as your mate. No more hiding, no more shame. If we are going to do this, we do it together. Kale felt fear spike through him. The council would see Lyra as a threat the moment they knew what she was. But he also knew. She was right. He had spent too long hiding, too long letting fear dictate his choices. It was time to be brave, time to stand for something more than just power. Agreed, he said. Tomorrow I will announce to the kingdom that you are my mate, and then we begin the work of tearing down everything rotten and building something better in its place. Lyra's smile widened. Tomorrow, she agreed. But tonight, let us just be Kale and Lyra. Let us be two wolves who have found each other against all odds, and let that be enough. They spent that night together, not in the physical claiming that Kale's wolf desperately wanted, but in quiet conversation and gentle affection. Lyra told him stories about her childhood, about her mother's courage, and the beauty of the lunar Omega traditions. Kyle told her about his own mother, about his father's murder, about the idealistic boy he had been before the world beat him down. They shared their scars and their hopes, and by the time dawn broke, Kale felt like he had found something he thought he had lost forever. He had found home, not in a place, but in a person. The announcement of their mate bond sent shockwaves through the kingdom. The pack leaders were surprised but cautiously supportive. Many of them secretly relieved that their harsh king might be softening. The common wolves were curious and hopeful, seeing Lyra's influence as a potential path to better treatment. But the council was furious. They convened an emergency meeting, demanding that Kale explain himself. How could he take an unregistered Omega as a mate? How could he elevate someone with no pack status to the position of queen? It was unseemly. It was dangerous. It undermined the very hierarchy they had worked so hard to maintain. Kale sat at the head of the council table with Lyra beside him, her hand in his, and he looked at each counselor in turn. Gentlemen, he said, his voice cold and commanding, I have recently learned some very disturbing things about the history of this kingdom and about the role this council has played in shaping policy. I know about the lunar bloodline. I know what you did to them. And I know about the Omega trafficking operation you have been running under my nose. The room went deathly silent. Darius's face went pale, while Thorn's expression turned calculating. "Your Majesty," Darius said carefully, "I do not know what lies you have been told, but I assure you—" "Enough," Cale cut him off, his alpha power flooding the room. "Do not insult my intelligence by denying it. I have seen the evidence. I have the documentation, and I have a mate who can see the truth in ways you cannot hide from. You used me. You turned me into a tyrant to serve your own greed. You destroyed an entire bloodline because they threatened your power, and you have been profiting from the suffering of Omegas while claiming it was for the good of the kingdom." Thorn stood abruptly, his face twisted with anger. "You have no proof that would stand up in any court. And even if you did, you are implicated in all of it, Cale. Every law you enforced, every policy you upheld, you are just as guilty as we are. You cannot expose us without destroying yourself." Cale smiled, and it was not a kind expression. "Perhaps," he said, "but I am willing to accept that consequence if it means ending your corruption. I am prepared to step down from the throne if necessary, to face judgment for my crimes alongside yours, because unlike you, I have finally remembered that some things are more important than power." The council erupted in protest, but Cale silenced them with a roar that shook the windows. "Here is what is going to happen," he said. "You are all going to resign from your positions immediately. You are going to turn over all evidence of your trafficking operations and any other illegal activities. You will make full restitution to the families you have harmed. And then you are going to retire quietly, because if you resist, I will ensure that every wolf in this kingdom knows exactly what you have done. I will make your crimes public, and I will let the people decide your fate." Darius laughed bitterly. "And you think they will let you remain king after learning that you were our willing participant in all of this? You are signing your own death warrant, Cale." "Perhaps," Cale agreed, "but at least I will die with my honor intact, something I lost years ago, and am only now reclaiming." Lyra stood beside him, her presence a quiet strength. "The council has 3 days to comply," she said, her voice calm but firm. "After that, the evidence goes public regardless. Choose wisely, gentlemen." The meeting ended in chaos, with counselors shouting threats and accusations, but Kyle remained unmoved. Over the next 3 days, the council tried everything to maintain their power. They attempted to turn the pack leaders against Cale, but Marcus had already been quietly sharing evidence of the council's crimes with trusted alphas, and most were appalled. They tried to have Lyra arrested on trumped-up charges, but Cale's personal guard, loyal to their king rather than the council, refused to carry out the orders. They even attempted to flee the kingdom with their wealth, but Cale had already frozen their assets and posted guards at the borders. On the 3rd day, faced with no other options, the council submitted their resignations and turned over the evidence Kyle demanded. But victory came with a price. The kingdom now knew the full extent of the corruption that had existed at the highest levels of government, and they knew that Cale had been complicit. There were calls for his abdication, protests in the streets demanding justice. Cale stood on the balcony of the castle, looking out at his people, and knew that the easy path would be to step down, to disappear, and let someone else clean up the mess. But Lyra took his hand and said, "You cannot run from this. You have to face it, own it, and prove through your actions that you have changed." Cale called for a kingdom-wide assembly, the largest gathering of wolves in the Northern Territories in decades. He stood before his people without armor or guards, vulnerable and exposed, and he told them everything. He confessed to his crimes, acknowledged the harm he had caused, and offered no excuses. "I cannot undo the suffering I have inflicted," he said, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. "I cannot give back the years that were stolen, or erase the pain that my laws caused. All I can offer is my commitment to spend the rest of my life making amends. I am prepared to face any punishment you deem appropriate, including removal from the throne. But if you allow me to remain as your king, I swear that I will dedicate myself to creating a kingdom built on justice and compassion rather than fear." The crowd was restless, angry voices calling for vengeance, others calling for mercy. Then Lyra stepped forward. She had not planned to speak, but she felt compelled to share her own truth. "I am a lunar omega," she said, and the crowd gasped. "My family was destroyed by the corruption that infected this kingdom long before Kale took the throne. I have every reason to want revenge, to demand that he suffer as my people suffered. But I have looked into his heart, and I have seen his genuine remorse. I have watched him dismantle his own power structure to expose the truth. Punishing him might feel satisfying, but it will not heal our kingdom. What will heal us is choosing to build something better together." What happened next surprised everyone. An elderly Omega woman stepped forward from the crowd, her voice trembling but clear. "I lost my daughter to the trafficking rings," she said. "For years, I blamed the Alpha King, and I was right to blame him. But I also know that revenge will not bring her back. If he is truly willing to change, if he will work to ensure no other family suffers as mine did, then I am willing to give him that chance." One by one, other wolves stepped forward, some with stories of suffering, others with words of forgiveness. The mood of the crowd slowly shifted from anger to something more complex, a collective decision to choose healing over vengeance. In the end, the kingdom voted to allow Kale to remain as Alpha King, but with conditions. He would establish an oversight council made up of representatives from all wolf classifications, not just alphas. He would personally oversee the dismantling of all oppressive Omega laws and the Omaoi, creation of new legislation based on equality. He would ensure that all victims of the trafficking rings received restitution and support, and he would submit to regular reviews of his leadership, with the understanding that the people could remove him if he failed to uphold his promises. Kale accepted every condition without hesitation. The work of rebuilding the kingdom was immense and exhausting. Kale spent his days in endless meetings, working with newly elected representatives to draft fair laws. He personally met with families who had been harmed by his policies, listening to their stories and offering what amends he could. Lyra worked alongside him, using her healing gifts to help those traumatized by years of oppression, and establishing schools where lunar Omega traditions could be taught and preserved. Together, they began to transform the Northern Territories from a kingdom ruled by fear into one guided by compassion. It was not easy. There were setbacks and resistance, wolves who clung to the old hierarchies and resented the changes. Some nights, Kale would collapse into bed, exhausted and doubting whether he could truly make a difference. But Lyra was always there, reminding him that change was a marathon, not a sprint, that every small victory mattered. And slowly, gradually, the kingdom began to heal. Omegas who had been forced into hiding came forward, reclaiming their dignity. Alphas who had relied on dominance to lead learned to inspire loyalty through respect instead. The Northern Territories became known not for its cruelty, but for its commitment to justice. 2 years after Lyra smiled at Kale's roar, they stood together in the same ceremony square where they had first met. But this time, it was not an allegiance ceremony built on fear. It was a celebration, a festival honoring the anniversary of the reforms and the progress the kingdom had made. Kale looked out at the crowd and saw faces that were no longer tense with terror, but alive with genuine joy. He saw Omegas standing proud and free, children playing without fear, pack leaders who had learned to value all their members equally, and he felt, for the first time in over a decade, something like peace. Are you moved by Kale's transformation from tyrant to compassionate leader? Do you believe in the power of love to change even the darkest heart? Let me know what touched you most about this story in the comments, and do not forget to like and subscribe for more supernatural romance tales. Lyra leaned against him, her hand resting on her slightly rounded belly. In a few months, they would welcome their first child, a daughter who would carry both Alpha and Omega blood, a symbol of the new world they were building. "We did it," she said softly. "We broke the cycle." Kale wrapped his arm around her, his mate, his partner, his salvation. "No," he said. "You did it. You saw something in me worth saving when everyone else including myself, had given up. You taught me that. Roaring might command submission, but true strength lies in choosing compassion over cruelty. Lyra smiled up at him, that same radiant smile that had started everything. We did it together, she corrected. You were willing to change, willing to face your demons and do the hard work of becoming better. That courage came from you, Kyle. I just helped you remember it was there. Kale kissed her forehead, overwhelmed with gratitude for this extraordinary Omega, who had saved him in every way a person could be saved. Around them, the festival continued, music and laughter filling the air, and Kale thought about how different this was from the silent, fearful ceremonies of his early reign. As the sun set over the northern territories, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Kale reflected on everything that had led to this moment. The pain, the mistakes, the long journey from monster back to man. He would never be able to fully atone for what he had done, would never be able to erase the suffering his cruelty had caused. But he could, and would, spend the rest of his life working to ensure that no one else in his kingdom had to experience that kind of oppression. He could be the leader his younger self had dreamed of becoming, the alpha who ruled with wisdom and compassion rather than fear. Lyra's visions had shown her glimpses of the future. A northern territories where all wolves, regardless of their classification, could live with dignity and freedom, where Omegas were celebrated for their gifts, rather than subjugated for their perceived weakness, where alphas led through inspiration, rather than intimidation. It would take generations to fully realize that vision, but they had laid the foundation. Their daughter would grow up in a world fundamentally different from the one Lyra and Kale had known, and that made every struggle worth it. That night, as they returned to the castle, Kale and Lyra walked through his mother's garden, which had become a public space, open to all who sought peace and beauty. The roses bloomed more vibrantly than ever, as if they too sensed the change in the kingdom's spirit. Kyle paused beside the fountain his mother had commissioned, remembering her words about beauty being resistance against darkness. She would have loved you, he told Lyra. My mother always believed that compassion was the truest form of strength. She would have seen in you everything she hoped I would find. Lyra rested her head on his shoulder. I wish I could have met her, she said. But I think I know her through you, through the parts of yourself you have reclaimed. She lives on in the choices you make now, in the kingdom you are building. That is a legacy worth honoring. Kale felt tears prick his eyes, something that would have been unthinkable during his years as a tyrant. Now, he allowed himself to feel fully, to grieve and hope and love without armor. It was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. In the years that followed, the Northern Territories became a model for other wolf kingdoms, proof that even the most entrenched systems of oppression could be dismantled and replaced with something better. Kale and Lyra's daughter, Arya, grew up surrounded by love and taught that leadership was about service, not domination. She inherited her mother's healing gifts and her father's strength. But more importantly, she learned from both of them that the greatest power lay in choosing compassion, even when anger would be easier, forgiveness even when vengeance seemed justified. Kale never forgot what he had been. He carried the weight of his past crimes always, let them inform his decisions and keep him humble. But he also learned to forgive himself enough to move forward, to believe that he was more than the worst things he had done. Lyra was his constant companion in this journey, challenging him when he needed it, supporting him when he faltered, loving him through all his imperfections. Their bond became legendary. The Alpha King and the Omega Queen, who transformed a kingdom through love. The council members who had resigned were required to perform community service, working directly with the Omega communities they had exploited. Some genuinely changed, confronted with the human cost of their greed. Others remained bitter and resentful, but they were powerless to stop the progress sweeping through the kingdom. Their trafficking operations were dismantled completely, and severe penalties were established for anyone who attempted to revive such practices. The Northern Territories became a safe haven for Omegas from other regions who sought refuge from oppression. Marcus remained as Kale's beta, and together they built a new kind of leadership structure, one that valued diverse perspectives and shared decision-making. the oversight council that the people had demanded, became a powerful force for accountability, ensuring that no single leader could ever again accumulate the kind of unchecked power Kyle had once wielded. It was messy and complicated. Democracy always was, but it was infinitely better than the alternative. On the 10th anniversary of Lyra's arrival in the Northern Territories, the kingdom held a massive celebration. Kyle stood before his people, now graying at the temples but stronger in spirit than he had ever been, and he spoke about the journey they had all taken together. 10 years ago, he said, I roared at an Omega and expected her to bow. Instead, she smiled. And that smile changed everything. It showed me that there was another way to lead, another way to live. It took courage I did not know I possessed to walk away from the comfort of cruelty and embrace the harder path of compassion. But every day since, I have been grateful for that choice. Lyra stood beside him, their daughter Arya now a young woman preparing to take on leadership responsibilities of her own, and 2 younger children playing at their feet. The crowd cheered, not out of fear but out of genuine affection for their king and queen who had proven through years of consistent action that their commitment to change was real. Kale looked out at his kingdom, at the faces of wolves who had learned to hope again, and he felt his mother's presence as if she were standing beside him, proud of the man he had finally become. As the celebration continued into the night, Kale pulled Lyra aside to the quiet garden where they had shared so many important moments. Do you remember what you said? To me? He asked. That first day in the throne room? You said I was not the monster I pretended to be, that I was a wounded wolf who had forgotten there was another way. Lyra nodded, her golden eyes soft in the moonlight. I remember, she said. And I was right, was I not? You proved it every day since. Kale took both her hands in his. You saved me, he said. Not just from my enemies or from the council's corruption, but from myself. You saw me when I was lost in darkness, and you refused to let me stay there. I will spend eternity being grateful for your smile, for your courage, for your love. Lyra reached up and touched his face gently. We saved each other, she said. You gave me a home when I had been running my whole life. You gave my people's legacy a chance to live again. You chose the harder path, the one that required you to face everything you had done and work every day to be better. That is not something I did for you, Kale. That is something you did for yourself. For our children. For our kingdom. I am just grateful I got to walk beside you on that journey. They kissed under the stars. 2 wolves who had found each other against impossible odds. Who had transformed pain into purpose and fear into love. And somewhere in the Northern Territories, in villages and towns and cities across the kingdom, other wolves looked up at those same stars and felt hope. Because if an alpha king as cruel as Kale Voss could change, if a kingdom as broken as theirs could heal, then anything was possible. The roar of dominance had been replaced by the quiet strength of compassion, and it was a far more powerful force than fear had ever been. Years later, when historians wrote about this era, they called it the Great Reformation, the time when the Northern Territories transformed from oppression to equality, but those who lived through it knew it by a simpler name. They called it the time when an Omega smiled and a king remembered his heart. And that smile, that moment of connection between 2 souls who should have been enemies but chose to be partners instead, became the foundation upon which a better world was built. It was proof that love could triumph over hate, that redemption was possible for even the most lost souls, and that sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was not roar in dominance, but choose compassion in the face of cruelty. What an incredible journey from darkness to light, from cruelty to compassion. If this story touched your heart, please give it a like and share your thoughts in the comments about which moment resonated with you most. Do not forget to subscribe for more epic supernatural romance stories where love transforms even the darkest souls. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the most powerful act of courage is choosing to smile in the face of fear.